Cahaba, the capital that drowned twice, a river town carved from a swamp, a state house built atop an ancient burial ground, a Civil War prison where 3,000 captured Union soldiers lived in a building meant for 500, and when the war ended, the survivors climbed aboard a steamboat called the Sultana. The Mississippi River turned black with their ashes. This is not a Southern Gothic novel. This is Cahaba, Alabama, the first capital of the state and one of the most haunted ghost towns in America. They built it on a lie, they abandoned it to the river, and they never truly left. Segment 1, the capital on the swamp. In 1818, a year before Alabama even became a state, the territorial legislature did something that still baffles historians. They picked a location for their future capital that made no sense whatsoever. Not near the coast, not on high ground, not along any existing trade route. They chose a lower-lying strip of land where the Cahaba River bleeds into the Alabama River, a swampy floodplain that had been home to Native American villages for centuries. The name Cahaba itself comes from the Choctaw words for water above, a fitting description for a place that would spend most of its existence underwater. The man responsible was William Wyatt Bibb, Alabama's first governor. He had a vision. He would build a grand capital on this muddy patch of earth, a shining monument to the new state's ambition. But when surveyors arrived to lay out the streets, they made a chilling discovery. The land was already occupied, not by living people, but by the dead. Archaeologists have since confirmed that Cahaba was built directly atop the remains of an earlier Native American village dating back 4,000 years. Some experts believe the earlier village was the legendary Morbula, the settlement destroyed by Spanish explorer Hernando de Soto in 1540. Governor Bibb not only found the remains of this ancient village, he incorporated the old earthworks into the centerpiece of his town plan. He planned to build Alabama's first state house atop an ancient Indian mound. The dead would serve as the foundation for the living. He also intended to use a semicircular moat dug around the ancient village 3 centuries earlier to restrict the grounds of the state house. Funding shortages and his untimely death prevented him from fully realizing his plan, but he did enough. The town rose quickly. By 1820, Cahaba had schools, hotels, a bank, a newspaper, a brand new state house. It was a wilderness city carved from nothing, and for a brief moment it gleamed. The gleam did not last. Cahaba's detractors had warned of flooding and disease. The rivers rose every spring, lapping at the foundations of the town's finest homes. The air was thick with what doctors of the era called miasma, the belief that disease was carried by foul smells. In reality, the mosquitoes that bred in the stagnant water carried malaria, yellow fever, and cholera. People, os, witi, bos, died. They died often. In 1825, the state legislature voted to move the capital to Tuscaloosa. Within weeks, Cahaba was nearly abandoned. Its proud residents packed their belongings and followed the government north, leaving behind empty streets and the graves of those who had not survived. But Cahaba refused to die completely. After the capital left, the town reinvented itself. It remained the county seat, and more importantly, it sat at the heart of Alabama's Black Belt, a region of fertile soil that produced cotton in staggering quantities. That cotton was grown and harvested by enslaved people, hundreds of them laboring in fields that stretched to the horizon. By the 1850s, the town boomed again. Steamboats crowded the riverfront, loaded with bales destined for the port of Mobile. A railroad line was laid in 1859, triggering a building boom. On the eve of the Civil War, more than 3,000 people called Cahaba home. Of those, 1,200 were black and 720 were white. The majority of the black population were enslaved. Then the war came, and with it, a darkness that would never leave. Segment 2, the prison and the steamboat. The Confederate Army seized the town's railroad and removed the iron rails to extend a line elsewhere, severing Cahaba's economic lifeline. And then, in a decision that would haunt the town forever, the Confederacy chose Cahaba as the site of a prison camp. Castle Morgan, they called it. A cotton warehouse built in 1860, 193 feet long and 116 feet wide, with walls 14 feet high. It measured only 15,000 square feet and was designed to hold around 500 men. By March 1865, more than 3,000 captured Union soldiers were packed inside. The building was unfinished, its roof never completed. The prisoners were locked inside at night and allowed into a stockade yard during the day. Disease ran through the ranks like fire through dry grass. Food was scarce. Many of the men had been captured during brutal cavalry raids, arriving at the prison exhausted, starving, and stripped of their uniforms. They slept on dirt floors. They drank from the same river that flooded their cells every spring. And yet, against all logic, Castle Morgan had the lowest death rate of any Civil War prison camp. The commanding officer, Captain H.M. Henderson, was a Methodist minister. He treated the prisoners with remarkable humanity, extending kindnesses and courtesies wherever he could. He allowed them to receive food packages from home. He permitted religious services. He even let the prisoners organize their own camp police to maintain order. Only about 125 men died within the prison walls over the course of the war, a fraction of the death tolls seen at camps like Andersonville, where 13,000 men perished in 14 months. When the war ended in April 1865, the survivors walked out of Castle Morgan. They had endured captivity, starvation, disease, and the humiliation of defeat. They had survived. They wanted only one thing: to go home. Many of those released boarded the steamboat Sultana in Vicksburg, Mississippi. A few days after President Abraham Lincoln's assassination, the Sultana was a sidewheel steamer rated to carry 376 passengers. She took on more than 2,400. Most were Union soldiers heading north, desperate to see their families after years of war. The ship was overcrowded, her boilers patched with iron plates, her crew exhausted. On April 27, 1865, just after 2 o'clock in the morning, the Sultana's 4 boilers exploded. The blast threw men into the air like rag dolls. The superstructure collapsed. The Mississippi River turned into an inferno of steam, fire, and drowning men. An estimated 1,800 of the 2,427 passengers died. Soldiers who had survived Confederate prisons, who had walked out of Castle Morgan with their lives, drowned in the dark water or burned to death on the wreckage. Bodies floated downstream for weeks. Some were never recovered. The Sultana disaster remains the greatest maritime disaster in United States history. More people died than on the Titanic, more than on the Lusitania, and almost no one remembers because it happened the same month. Lincoln was shot because the nation was exhausted by war, because the dead were just soldiers, and soldiers were supposed to die. The men of Castle Morgan did not die in the prison. They died on the river, and their ghosts, some say, never left the waters around Cahaba. Segment 3. The flood that ended everything. The war ended, but Cahaba's suffering did not. In 1865, the same year the last prisoners were released, the rivers rose again. The rising water left the remaining residents standing in knee-deep water for days. But this flood was different. It did not recede quickly, leaving behind mud and the promise of rebuilding. It inundated the town, swallowing streets, drowning foundations, washing away whatever hope remained. The state legislature moved the county seat to Selma in 1866. The businesses followed. The families followed. Within 10 years, houses were dismantled and moved, their timbers hauled away to build new lives elsewhere. During Reconstruction, the abandoned courthouse became a meeting place for freedmen seeking political power, and Cahaba briefly became known as the Mecca of the Radical Republican Party. A new community of 70 former slave families replaced the old urban center, turning the vacant town blocks into 20-acre fields. Even that community soon disappeared. By 1900, most of Cahaba's buildings had burned, fallen in, or been dismantled. Few structures survived past 1930, but the town was not officially unincorporated until 1989. By that time, only fishermen and hunters walked its abandoned streets. They reported strange things: lights on the river where no boats were docked, voices carried on the wind from houses that no longer stood, the feeling of being watched from the tree line, the sense that something or someone was still there. Today, Old Cahaba Archaeological Park encompasses 853 acres. The Alabama Historical Commission maintains it as a museum of ruins, cemeteries, and overgrown streets. Towering oaks draped in Spanish moss, wisteria vines climbing the remnants of old foundations, the last remnants of St. Luke's Wow's Episcopal Church, a carpenter Gothic chapel built in 1854, dismantled and moved in 1878, finally returned to the site in 2007. Visitors can walk where lawmakers once debated, where steamboats once docked, where thousands of enslaved people once lived and died, and many visitors come for another reason entirely. They come looking for the dead. Segment 4. The ghosts and the question that remains the most famous spirit of Cahaba belongs to Colonel C. Pegues, a Confederate officer who commanded Alabama's 5th Rifle Regiment. He was mortally wounded in battle, shot down somewhere in Virginia or Tennessee, depending on which account you trust. His body was brought home to Cahaba, laid to rest in the family plot, and then, shortly after his death, something strange began to appear. A floating orb of white light, luminous and silent, drifting through the cedar groves behind his former home. It moved without sound, without purpose, just a glowing sphere bobbing among the trees. Phenomenon became known as Pegues' ghost. Some say it is the colonel himself, unable to leave the land he loved. Others believe it is one of the prisoners who died in Castle Morgan, or a restless spirit from the ancient Indian burial ground. The orb has been seen for decades by dozens of witnesses, always in the same place, always silent, always watching. But Pegues is not the only spirit wandering the ruins. The slave burial ground was created in 1819, the same year the town was founded. A square block was originally set aside for this purpose, but the graves appear to have been placed along a long, narrow ridge to avoid flooding. Hundreds of bodies are buried there, but only a handful have headstones. On an 1883 map, it was labeled Negro Burial Ground. The rest lie beneath the grass, anonymous, forgotten. The last known burial occurred in 1957. Visitors report feeling watched from the woods. Others have heard whispers when no one is there. Some have captured photographs of shadowy figures that vanish when you turn your head. The haunted history tours held at the park draw hundreds of visitors each year. Unlike typical haunted houses with jump scares and actors in costumes, these tours focus on real ghost stories passed down through generations. Tales from the Civil War era, recent experiences from staff and visitors. There are no fake screams, no fake blood, just the stories told around a fire pit under the Spanish moss, with the ruins of Alabama's first capital looming in the darkness. Now it is time to separate the legend from the truth. The flooding was real, the disease was real, the prison was real, with a remarkably low death rate due to a kind-hearted Methodist commandant. The slave burial ground is real, with hundreds of bodies and only a few headstones. The Sultana disaster was real, and 1,800 men who had survived the war died within sight of the shore. The orb of light has been reported by too many witnesses to dismiss entirely. I know, but is it the ghost of Colonel Peggs, or is it swamp gas, methane from the low-lying ground igniting into floating lights? Is it the imagination playing tricks in the dark, primed by stories and fear? The staff at the park do not claim to have definitive proof of anything. They simply share the stories as they have been shared with them. But here is the thing about Cahaba. You do not need ghosts to be unsettled there. You only need history. The knowledge that 3,000 men were locked in a warehouse and that 125 of them died there, buried in unmarked graves. The knowledge that hundreds of enslaved people worked the cotton fields, died in the cabins, and were buried beneath a small number of headstones. The knowledge that 1,800 soldiers survived the prison only to drown in the Mississippi, their bodies lost to the current. The knowledge that a state built its capital on a floodplain on top of a sacred Native American village, ignored every warning, and then walked away when the water rose. The real horror of Cahaba is not a floating orb. It is not a Confederate colonel. The real horror is that we built a city on the backs of enslaved people, fought a war to keep them in chains, and then abandoned their descendants to the rising river. The real horror is that we remember the names of the governors and the colonels, but the slaves have no headstones. The real horror is that the Sultana disaster is almost forgotten, lost in the shadow of Lincoln's assassination. The town sits there today, silent, overtaken by trees, slowly crumbling back into the earth from which it was carved. The rivers still rise, the Spanish moss still sways, and the orb still appears in the cedar groves, glowing white against the dark Alabama sky. Sometimes the most terrifying thing is not the ghost, it is the history we refuse to face, and Cahaba has more history than most of us can bear. The capital that drowned twice still whispers from the water. If you listen closely, you can hear it. Voices on the wind, footsteps on empty streets, the quiet hum of 3,000 prisoners who never got to go home, and the orb still glows in the orchard, waiting, watching, always watching.